What if a man quietly walked into a corporate lobby and was thrown out simply because of how he looked? Would you be so sure he isn't the one who owns the entire building? The main lobby of Sterling Heights on a Monday morning is always bustling, but this morning felt different. The air was thick, taut like a string, pulled one note too high. The crystal chandelier reflected off the polished marble floor, casting shimmering patterns among luxury suits, glossy Italian leather shoes, and polite laughter echoing off the soaring glass walls. One of the men who walked in drew a few glances before those eyes quickly turned away. Isaiah Morgan. He wore a charcoal grey suit cut with precision, a matching tie, and flawless Italian leather shoes. Yet, despite the perfection of his appearance, the silent judgments came anyway, as if his presence in that space was a curious exception. He approached the reception desk with an embossed invitation in hand, stamped in gold with the Sterling Heights seal, the corporation preparing to unveil the $700 million Phoenix expansion. The invitation clearly read, 10 o'clock a.m., meeting with the senior executive board. Isaiah was not late. He was right on time, even early. But that didn't help. The receptionist, Sophie, looked up when Isaiah handed her the invitation. For a split second, her eyes skimmed his face as if trying to decode who he was, before settling back into a cool, professional demeanor. "We'll take care of it right away, sir," she said flatly, avoiding eye contact. Her fingers tapped the keyboard with more force than necessary before she continued, "Please step over here and wait a moment. We're currently assisting VIP guests." Isaiah tilted his head politely, replying, "I have an appointment with Mr. Lambert, head of strategy, at 10 sharp. Sophie didn't flinch. "We'll be with you shortly," she said, returning to her screen as though Isaiah had vanished from her world. Isaiah stepped aside. He didn't raise his voice, didn't react. He simply stood there, his sharp gaze scanning the room's every detail. Just then, a white family entered, the father in a navy suit, the mother draped in a silk trench coat, 2 blonde children in uniforms from a prestigious international school. Sophie sprang up from her chair, her smile appearing as if conjured by magic. "Welcome, Whitman family. We've prepared the VIP lounge for you." She waved her hand. A staff member rolled up with a tray of champagne, and the red velvet rope was drawn aside. No IDs were checked, no questions asked. Meanwhile, Isaiah, the only one with a formal invitation, remained in place, like someone who had shown up uninvited. A security guard approached, heavy-footed, eyes already fixed on Isaiah, as though identifying a potential threat. "Let me see your ID," he said bluntly. Isaiah handed over both his ID and the invitation. The guard flipped the paper over a few times, like he was looking for a mistake, then gave Isaiah a skeptical once-over. "What's your purpose here?" Isaiah's voice remained calm. "I have a meeting with the board regarding the Phoenix project." The guard gave a non-committal nod and walked away without apology or further explanation. Isaiah was left alone, surrounded by people who refused to see him. He was directed to a metal chair near the door, a seat typically reserved for walk-in visitors of no importance. No one offered him a drink. No one asked him anything more. Around him, the chatter of those deemed VIPs rang out like the language of a parallel universe, a world in which Isaiah clearly did not belong. But Isaiah didn't react. He simply tightened his tie, sat upright, rested his hand gently on his leather briefcase, and waited. Not because he lacked the power to speak up, but because he understood, sometimes silence is the first step of a storm. And storms do not ask for permission. Time passed as slowly as drops of water falling onto stone, making no sound but wearing away patience all the same. Isaiah sat quietly in the shadowed corner near the entrance, where the sunlight streaming through the glass reached only halfway up his torso. Each time the automatic doors turned, a new wave of elegantly dressed guests flowed into the lobby, greeted by Sophie's glowing smile and the familiar nod of security guard Troy. No one paid attention to the man sitting still as a statue. Perhaps they thought he was a driver, waiting for his boss, or an employee running late. But no one imagined he was the man who held the fate of the entire building in his hands. Laughter from the Whitman family echoed from the VIP lounge, followed by the brisk click of heels as Sophie hurried over to greet Senior Manager Craig Preston, emerging from the elevator. Craig did not glance at Isaiah, as if the mere act of looking might smudge the lenses perched on his nose. "Is the meeting room ready for the Whitmans?" he asked, without lifting his eyes from the tablet in his hand. "Of course, sir," Sophie replied with a chirpy tone. "And the man over there," she gestured subtly toward Isaiah. "Still unclear. He wasn't on the early guest list." Craig nodded without asking further and walked toward where Isaiah sat. "Mr. Morgan," Craig said, his tone colder than the lobby's air conditioning. "We need confirmation that you are not part of this morning's VIP guest group. To avoid any confusion, I'll need you to sign this form." He handed over a document titled Declaration of Non-Interference with VIP Coordination Activities. The language was dressed up as routine policy, but Isaiah knew better. This was a veiled insult wrapped in administrative jargon. He took the paper and read it slowly, line by line, as if watching a familiar play with a script he had already memorized. Craig stood there, one hand in his pocket, the disdain in his eyes barely concealed. A few interns near the front desk began to glance Isaiah's way, part curiosity, part tension. From across the room, Troy stood with arms folded, eyes alert as if ready to intervene at any moment. Isaiah folded the paper neatly and placed it on the small table beside him. He didn't sign it, nor did he speak. He simply raised the glass of water he'd poured from the nearby machine and took a slow sip. The air grew heavier. His silence was not weakness. It was a refusal, unspoken yet unmistakable, to play by the rules they had invented. Craig hesitated, surprised by the calm defiance. Sophie looked toward Craig, as if about to say something, but stopped short. In that fleeting moment, Isaiah caught a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. Not enough to be called regret, but enough to show that she knew something was wrong. Still, like so many before her, she chose the safer path. Sophie turned away, pretending to adjust the guest list on her screen. Isaiah set his glass down, straightened his tie again, and checked his watch. 15 minutes to the scheduled meeting. But he wasn't in a rush. He had waited his entire life to reach this point, a point from which a single nod could rewrite the destiny of this entire building. And sometimes, it is those considered invisible who see everything the clearest. Isaiah's stillness was not submission. It was strategy. It was awe. And it was a warning they were still too naive to hear. As the clock hand ticked just past 10, the side glass door opened and a sturdy figure stepped in. Brandt, the new deputy security chief recently transferred from the southern branch. His gaze swept across Isaiah, then quickly shifted to Sophie. She didn't need to say much. A subtle nod, barely noticeable if one wasn't paying attention, was enough for Brandt to understand. The order wasn't spoken aloud, but it rang as clearly as if someone had shouted, "Get him out of here!" Brandt strode straight toward Isaiah without preamble or courtesy, the way his hand gripped Isaiah's arm, quick firm and cold as steel, made a few interns flinch. "Get up. Come with me," Brandt said in a gravelly voice, offering no trace of the politeness usually reserved for business guests. Isaiah didn't react immediately. He looked Brandt straight in the eyes, not angry, not defiant, just present with such unsettling calm that it threw Brandt off balance. But then Isaiah stood up, every movement maintaining an eerie composure. It all happened in plain view of guests sipping lattes and chatting with assistants. They only looked up for a brief breath, then returned to their conversations as if the scene had nothing to do with them. The silence wasn't indifference. It was complicity, the familiar kind practiced by those too afraid to touch injustice for fear it might stain their hands. Brandt led Isaiah through the hallway behind the service area, where the lighting turned a sickly yellow. The marble floors gave way to industrial tiles, and the air was thick with the scent of damp and mold. They stopped in front of a battered door labeled Visitor Overflow Room. Isaiah stepped inside, and the door shut behind him with a dull, decisive thud, as if someone had sealed away a space built solely to make him disappear. Inside, the room contained nothing but a few stacked plastic chairs, peeling grey walls, and a scratched-up table. An old ceiling fan rotated slowly, emitting a faint whine like it was complaining about being forgotten. Isaiah set his briefcase down, adjusted his collar, and said nothing. He didn't need to ask why he'd been brought there. The answer had been written in the eyes of everyone who had seen him walk through the main entrance. Back outside, Sophie leaned into her walkie-talkie and murmured a phrase in a voice low but laced with poison. "He's been taken out. Be gentle but firm. People like that taint the space." No one pushed back. No one stopped her. And that was the real problem. Not that someone like Sophie could behave this way, but that everyone around her chose silence instead. At the front desk, Lily, the intern only 2 weeks into the job, watched everything unfold. She wasn't yet familiar with covert signals or unspoken orders, but this morning she learned a hard lesson about invisible power. Silence is not always neutral. Her hands trembled as she typed on the keyboard, pretending to check the guest list, but her eyes remained fixed on the door Brandt had closed, where a man was being handled simply because his presence made others uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Isaiah sat calmly in that cramped room. He wasn't angry. He didn't call anyone to object or send a message to clear things up. Instead, he opened his briefcase, pulled out a jet black tablet, and unlocked it using a triple-layer biometric scan. The screen lit up with a phoenix emblem, symbol of the Phoenix Project. A command prompt appeared. Isaiah tapped it gently. Suspend all project operations. Cease negotiations. No action to proceed without direct authorization from senior owner. He typed one final line. Activate alert protocol. Reason. Internal ethics review. Then he placed the tablet beside him, folded his arms, and waited. Not for an apology, but for the moment when those who dismissed him would realize they had just pressed the self-destruct button themselves. The phone on the reception desk rang, sudden and sharp like a needle piercing through the thickening air. Sophie flinched slightly, her eyes darting to the screen. Caller ID. Claudia Reynolds, chairwoman of the board. A chill crawled down her spine. She turned toward Craig Preston standing behind her and whispered, unable to hide the panic in her voice. "It's the chairwoman." Craig frowned and motioned for her to answer. Sophie swallowed hard and picked up the phone, her voice tight and strained. "Sterling Heights reception, how may I help you?" The voice on the other end responded immediately, calm but solid as granite. "This is Claudia Reynolds. Tell me the exact location of Mr. Isaiah Morgan, right now." Sophie froze. She glanced at Craig, whose face had already drained of color. I don't have any information on that guest," she lied, her eyes instinctively flicking toward the room where Brant had taken Isaiah earlier. Claudia's silence lasted exactly 3 seconds, long enough for every pore on Sophie's body to tighten. Then her voice came again, this time like the icy edge of a January storm. "Isaiah Morgan is the primary signatory on the entire Phoenix contract. He is the largest shareholder of Sterling Heights, and he has just ordered a full project shutdown due to a serious internal issue. I will ask once more, where is he?" The words detonated in the lobby like a bomb. Craig snatched the phone, drenched in sweat, and stammered, "Madam Reynolds, we'll bring him to the executive suite immediately." But it was too late. Chloe, who just moments ago had been laughing with authority, now stood dazed in the wreckage of her own arrogance. Craig, usually so commanding as if the entire building belonged to him, now looked pale as someone about to collapse. Around the reception desk, staff began whispering, their eyes drifting toward the service door, where the nameless man had just been treated like an intruder. Sophie's heels clicked frantically as she hurried toward that door, her fingers trembling as they grasped the worn brass handle. She didn't knock. She simply pushed the door open and began mouthing an apology, as though learning to say sorry for the first time in a life that had never required it. "Mr. Morgan," she said in a quivering voice, "we deeply apologize for the mistake. We would like to escort you to the executive suite right away." Isaiah remained seated, the tablet now dark, placed neatly on the scratched table. The fluorescent light above cast a steady glow on his face. Not angry, not cold, just quiet in a way that made the person across from him feel incredibly small. He rose calmly, picked up his leather case, and walked past Sophie without saying a word. Each step he took carried the weight of a verdict they had written for themselves, etched not in blood, but in condescension. As Isaiah stepped out, the entire lobby seemed to turn to stone. The same eyes that once ignored him now dared not meet his. Craig retreated half a step, trying to mask his fear with an awkward nod. But Isaiah didn't stop. He didn't look back. He didn't speak or demand anything, because for him, silence had become the language of power, the very thing they once denied him, now spoken so loudly, they had no choice but to bow and listen. As Isaiah Morgan stepped into the grand lobby through the side entrance, all sound seemed to fall away. The tapping of keyboards, the pouring of coffee, the clack of shoes on marble floors, all of it felt suspended, as if gravity had shifted around something larger and far more serious. He walked past each stunned gaze, his footsteps striking the marble floor with steady rhythm, not hurried, but unwavering. And it was this very calmness that made those who had once looked at him with indifference unable to lift their eyes now. Emma, the only young intern who had once whispered, "Why didn't anyone double-check the invitation?" now stood behind the counter, hands frozen by the scanner, eyes fixed on the figure approaching the center of the lobby. Craig Preston, near the VIP elevator, was pale as a sheet, his forced smile faltering as he instinctively tried to step out of view. Isaiah stopped directly in the middle of the lobby, where the chandelier's light cast a glow that seemed to deliberately frame his presence. He looked straight at Craig and Sophie, who now huddled together like two people awaiting judgment. And then for the first time that morning, Isaiah spoke, not loud, but clear enough that everyone held their breath to listen. "You want to know who I am?" he asked, his voice low and even, not a hint of bitterness. "I'm the one you asked to sign a form, not to disturb VIP guests. The one told to stay away from brand image zones. The one just escorted out of this lobby by your deputy head of security without a single legitimate reason." He paused for just a beat, then continued. "But I am also the one who approved the entire $700 million budget for the Phoenix project, the principal shareholder, and the person who just today issued an indefinite suspension of that project." Somewhere behind him, a coffee cup crashed to the floor. Someone gasped, "No way!" But Isaiah didn't stop. He went on, "I didn't come here to make a scene. I came for a scheduled meeting with your executive board, on time, with a valid invitation. But instead of being treated like a partner, I was seen as a problem, an image that didn't fit." He turned slightly, casting his eyes towards Sophie, who was now gripping the reception desk for support. "Even after presenting the invitation, I was treated like a threat, and you did it without checking anything. Just one look at me was all it took for you to decide." The room felt frozen. No one moved. No one dared interrupt the flow of truth being poured out like molten steel. Craig stepped forward, hand slightly raised in a pleading gesture. "Mr. Morgan, we didn't know." But he never got to finish. Isaiah raised his hand, firm and full of authority. "No need to explain, because it's that very ignorance, that ease with which you pass judgment, that now places this company on the brink of a leadership crisis, an investment crisis, and an ethical crisis." At that moment, Emma slowly stepped out from behind the front desk. Her eyes were no longer filled with fear, but with a determined clarity. She stood beside Isaiah, saying nothing, simply standing there, as if to declare that not everyone would remain silent forever. Isaiah turned and walked toward the executive elevator, which now stood open. This time, no one tried to stop him, and no one dared to follow. And as the doors closed behind him, sealing him off from the lobby, a single truth settled over everyone like fog. They had not merely disrespected a man, they had just lost the greatest opportunity they ever had. Less than an hour after Isaiah stepped into the executive meeting room, the entire top floor of Sterling Heights, the once impenetrable stronghold of the corporate elite, fell into a state of emergency. An urgent meeting was launched through the internal secure system, joined remotely by major shareholders, regional executives, and chairwoman Claudia Reynolds herself. Her voice carried none of the usual corporate pleasantries, but instead rang with clarity, precision, and resolve. "The internal investigation begins today. Any act of discrimination, exclusion, or abuse of power will no longer have a place under Sterling's name." On the floors below, as part of the meeting's audio was streamed across corridor screens, the main lobby swirled with a storm of conflicting emotions. Craig Preston was immediately suspended. Security staff, Brandt and Troy, were summoned to respond to allegations of abuse and intimidation against a VIP guest. But the center of attention was Sophie. She stood frozen behind the reception desk, her hand trembling around the phone. In her entire career as a senior receptionist, Sophie had never imagined that a few unchecked assumptions and a glance laced with bias could leave an irreversible scar on her record. When the formal internal review summons hit her work email, she knew the door she once walked through with pride might never open the same way again. Emma, on the other hand, was called up to the 33rd floor. an unexpected gesture she couldn't quite comprehend. Stepping out of the elevator, she was greeted by Isaiah Morgan. He had no assistant, no display of corporate stature. Just a calm man with eyes both steady and warm. "Thank you," he said simply. "You didn't have to defend me. Just not turning away was enough." Isaiah did not fire people with harsh words. He did not rally for revenge. But the directives he left behind reshaped Sterling from within. Periodic ethical audits, mandatory unconscious bias training, revised HR policy, and an upgraded complaint handling system. Each change was a quiet but resolute period, penned by the same man who had once been forced to wait in a walk-in guest service room. As for Isaiah, he left Sterling 3 days later. No press conference, no interviews. He returned to the Phoenix Project at headquarters, where every employee, from intern to regional director, now referred to him by the proper title, Mr. Morgan. Yet his presence remained at Sterling, not just in new policies, but embedded in the conscience of those who witnessed the proud silence of a man once dismissed, only to be recognized, not with an apology, but through systemic change. Sophie, after receiving disciplinary action and reassignment to a small suburban branch, spent months coming to terms with the truth. What made her wrong wasn't attitude, but the belief that she had the right to decide someone's worth with just a glance. Each morning, behind her new reception desk, she no longer allowed herself the kind of gaze she once used so freely. Emma, 1 year later, became Sterling's youngest head of client relations, under 25. On her desk stood a small photo frame with a quote, "Not everyone in a suit is a VIP, and not everyone dressed simply is insignificant." Every time a new intern stepped into her office, she retold the story of that day, not as a tragedy, but as a moment of awakening. And Isaiah, he quietly continued investing in organizations built on justice, mentoring young leaders, and dedicating most of his time to community mentorship programs. When asked by a journalist why he never went public with what happened at Sterling, he simply smiled. The truth doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs to be proven. And sometimes a single day of being dismissed is enough to expose an entire belief system built on illusion. In today's corporate world, character is not defined by appearance or title, but by how one acts in the face of difference. The story of Isaiah Morgan is not just a wake-up call for those who are quick to judge based on looks, but a powerful reminder that true power does not need to be flashy. It only needs to speak up at the right moment. If you believe that respect should come before titles, like this video, subscribe to the channel so you never miss stories that shift perspectives, and leave a comment with the phrase, "Never underestimate," to help spread this message.